Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I hope that you're enjoying LTUE, learning a lot at this conference. I know that I always do. And welcome to your Friday evening. My name's Troy Lambert. If you haven't seen me around yet, I'm a freelance writer, author, editor, and co-owner of a small niche publishing business. But tonight, what we're going to talk about is perfect series planning to prevent stalls and burnout. Now, I want to talk to you about this topic. First of all, this is going to be a two-part topic. So we're going to talk about it for about 45 minutes here. We're going to kind of lay the foundation and go into really the first steps of writing your series. And then following that, we'll take a little bit of a break, and then we'll come back and go into depth with the last part of planning your series. And then I'll stick around after that for questions, just to let you know kind of what to expect. Now, the reason I am passionate about talking about this particular topic is because, first of all, I love writing series. Series are a blast. I feel like they're easier to write in many cases than standalone novels. And as far as commercially, they just tend to do better. You tend to make more money from a series than you do from standalone novels. That is not always the case, and I'm sure someone can prove me wrong, but this is just the way things typically work. I'm going to also, during this time, I'm going to use a software that I use to outline series and to outline my books. It's called Plottr. Full disclosure, I'm going to post a resources link when we're done with this session and when we're done with the second one as well. And that goes to a place on my website that basically gives you some resources for plotting and things like that, including that is Plottr. And some of the resources on that page are things I have affiliate links to. I absolutely love Plottr, so I actually work with them and for them a lot in presentations, but you don't have to use Plottr to use these methods. You can use these methods with any software that you're comfortable with. I've seen people do it in Excel, to do it in Word docs, Google Docs. I happen to write in Scrivener, outline in Plottr. If you're a person that outlines and writes in Scrivener, that is fantastic. What this is more about is the methods that you can use to plan your series so that basically you don't burn out, you don't give up, and you don't quit. Now, also, before we get started, after my full disclosure about that, it is also confession time. I have a series that I started to write with another author. We had a very ambitious publishing plan, a very ambitious writing plan. We had all these plans to get ahead of the game and be way ahead of having books written and having them just prepared to sail out the door when they were ready for publishing and things like that. And that did not work out. Essentially, we burned out. He had things going on in his life that were interfering with his writing time, making it difficult for him to get his portion of the work and his portion of the books done. We were editing things at the last minute, writing things at the last minute, waiting for each other to do things. We hadn't blended our writing styles well enough to decide how the books were going to look, so some of them looked very different. And so we actually ended up burning out. So we ended up slowing the series way down. I took over the series so he could focus on his family and those issues. And then I slowed the series way down, releasing books a lot further apart, taking more time to edit them and make sure that they were right, and to do all those various different things. And it's not that that series has not been a success. It doesn't continue to be a success. Is essentially we have a lot of audiobooks out at this point. It's actually a really great series, but it did produce some burnout and some friction, and that made things unpleasant. One of the reasons I wanted to do this presentation was I want to save you from the things that have happened to me. You don't have to burn out on a series. You can keep going on a series. You can plan it out well enough that you have a pathway to success. And I'm hopefully going to lead you through that. Now, the series I'm going to use that I'm going to talk about as an example is basically that series. It's called the Capital City Murders series. It's really easy to understand. The basic premise is There's a photographer, freelance photographer, Nick O'Flanagan. He's been assigned by Travel USA magazine to travel all around the country to every single state capital. He has 1 week in each one in which to take pictures of the Capitol building and the surrounding areas in the Capitol to give those that are going to read this book eventually a flavor for the city and for the area. And then it's going to be created into this huge Travel USA coffee table manual. But everywhere that Nick goes, he runs into a mystery. And because he's very detail oriented, he's a macro photographer, he always notices details that other people don't that help him to solve this mystery. So it's a combination of kind of a travel log mystery type thing with an amateur sleuth who solves crimes wherever he goes. And of course, this causes him various different problems and things like that along his journey. Okay, as far as a premise, it's a very, very simple premise. It's a very simple, big idea of the book. And then each book, of course, we had to come up with a mystery, and there's a lot of alliteration, overdoses in Olympia, slaying in Salem, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll see those as we go through. So I'm going to use that series as an example of how to plan a series. And I'm going to tell you about some of the things we did wrong and how we should have done them better and how you can do better than what we did. So let's dive right in. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lay a foundation. Okay, I'm going to lay a foundation for what a series looks like, what makes up a series, and so how you decide, is this idea the right one for a series? And is this a series I want to write? Okay, because that is really important. So the first thing we're going to talk about is ideas. So there are two types of ideas. So if you talk to most writers, they will tell you that, me included, that I have enough ideas that I can write from now until the day that I die and never run out of ideas to write about. I have enough ideas for novels and series and novellas and short stories and things like that I will never run out of ideas. Ideas have never been my problem. So I have lots of big ideas. The big idea is the general idea for your series. Like we talked about Capital City Murders, a photographer traveling to every single capital to take pictures, okay? Finds a mystery in every single capital. Simple, big idea. The big idea does not have to be complex. It can, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit. It can be a very simple premise, right? Then the small ideas are twofold. There's two types of small ideas. The smaller ideas are the ideas for the book. For instance, the first one in the series is called Overdoses in Olympia. So basically there have been overdoses in the city of Olympia, the first place that Nick travels from Seattle, where he lives, where his home is. It's the capital of Washington. So while he's taking the pictures and stuff like that, he also solves this mystery about these overdoses. That's a small idea as far as that's the idea of the book. The second category of smaller ideas, though, is how does he solve the crime? What does he notice in pictures that somebody else doesn't? And what's the mechanics of those, each idea chapter by chapter? How do we lay clues that the reader can pick up on? How do we set up that book so it's an actual story? Those are small ideas. That's the biggest difference between big ideas and small ideas. Where writers run into trouble in series is in those small ideas. Either a book stalls because they run out of the small ideas for that book, or the series stalls because they've run out of book ideas. They have a big overall idea, but they're like, what happens next? What happens in book 2? This is a common thing in trilogy. It's why in your novel, you'll often hear people talk about the sagging middle, the middle of your novel, where it basically comes down and it sags and you're like, oh no, I don't know what's happening. And then you figure it out and it goes back up towards the climax. But that middle part is just like a journey to get the characters from one place to another. And it tends to be, in some cases, kind of dull. And we always talk about in rewriting how you want to prop up that sagging middle, right? The same thing happens in series with trilogies, especially. The middle book of a trilogy tends to be the sagging middle of the series because you're trying to get your characters from this big idea you've got a book 1 to the big idea you've got a book 3. And this middle book is just a bridge. And it's more difficult to write than the 2 books on either end. Okay, so that's where you run out of small ideas there of how to make this particular book and this particular part of the series exciting. Okay, you don't have to do that. We're going to talk about, with some planning, you can plan what those ideas look like ahead of time so that you don't run out of steam. Even in the cases where you wrote a single novel and you decided, oh, this actually could be a series, you put a cliffhanger on the end, like, maybe it could be a series, maybe it couldn't, and you go on to write that. If you do go on to write that, some planning ahead of time will actually help you understand how that series should go forward. So that's the first thing. The second thing we will talk about is themes and plots. So typically, your series will have an overall theme. And the overall theme will be something about, can be anything. It can be related to your genre, or it can be a deeper, more in-depth theme. Maybe the theme of your entire series is redemption, is how this character goes from being a horrible person over here to being a great person over here. And it's that journey of redemption. That's what the theme of the series is. Or the theme of the series can be unity, and it's about how this fractured society comes together and forms a new, more unified society, right? Things like that. There usually is also an overall plot for your series. Okay, the overall plot for your series is kind of what I would call the A plot for your series. It's either the character journey or the overall journey of the plot, or some kind of combination of the two, and often that includes the antagonist journey as well. Remember, when the hero is feeling good and things are up for the hero, they're generally down for the antagonist. So that it can operate the same way in a series. The antagonist can have good books and bad books, and the hero can have books where he triumphs and books where he fails. And you can have an overall series plot that threads throughout the whole series. So you have a theme and a plot for that, but you also have a theme and a plot for each book. So each book has its own theme that probably should fit in with your overall theme of your series, but it also has its own plot and its own plot arc, which also should coincide with the overall plot of your series. The more you know, at least the framework. So some people are going to say, well, I'm a discovery writer and I don't really plot a lot of things way ahead of time. You don't have to have them plotted in detail, but if you have an overall framework of what you think is going to happen in the series and what you think is going to happen in each book, even if it's only a few points, it gives you some guideposts to go off of. And I would argue, and we can talk about that at another time, catch me at BarCon or some other time, and we can talk about how most writers are not pure discovery writers. They usually plot at some point along the way. It's just a matter of when they do their plotting, not if they actually plot or not. But you need both things. You need themes for the overall series and plots for the overall series, and themes and plots for each individual book. The greater you have those planned out and the greater you understand how they match up, the less likely you are to get stalled, because stalling also often happens when you go contrary to your theme or contrary to your plot at some point, especially in like a middle book, and then that throws off the plot of the entire series. So you have to rework the series to fit with that middle book plot, and that can create stalling and it can create problems. It can also create frustration for you as an author. Now, another thing to consider is how long the series is. First of all, how long the series is. Second of all, how long each book is. Now, it doesn't matter. We see from like the Wheel of Time series and other series, it doesn't matter how long the books are or how long the series is. If you write something that's enjoyable, that appeals to your audience, that appeals to readers of your particular genre, then it doesn't matter how long the books are. It doesn't matter how long the series is necessarily. You can keep those things going for a long time. In the example of Capital City Murders, what we decided was each book would be about novella length, between 20 and 25,000 words, sometimes maybe a little bit longer. And there's obviously going to be 50 of them. There's 50 state capitals. So determining the length of the series was relatively easy. Determining the length of each book was relatively easy. And then we decided, since printing a 25,000 word novella is not really a practical thing, and that's a whole other discussion we can have another time, but we decided that every 5 books, we put them in a compilation. in a large compilation, right? That includes 5 of those books. So usually that ends up being well over 100,000 words. It's a pretty hefty book, but hey, it's 5 different parts of the story, and we put those in a compilation. And then we actually do the same thing with audiobooks. We release an audiobook for each individual book, but release compilation audiobooks where you can get 10 plus hours of audio, 12 hours of audio for basically the same price as you would like a normal novella. And so it works out really well for those particular things. So that's how we decided upon the length of each book and then the length of the series. And so it was fairly obvious by the end of it, we've got 50 books plus 10 compilations. So we've got essentially 60 works that will appear on Amazon and in other publishing outlets and things like that. But in other cases, I mean, we look at, Game of Thrones. We look back to Game of Thrones again. There was a certain amount of a plan for the overall series. Of course, George R. R. Martin never did finish it. HBO finished it horribly for him. If you catch me later, I will tell you, and you've seen it, I will tell you my take on the final episode of Game of Thrones, but that's a whole other. But you can see that it was obviously HBO turned it into an 8-season and hugely epic shows, each episode that showed a huge amount of information in each one. So it doesn't really matter how long it is. It's just a matter of what you know of your readers and your target audience and what they will tolerate for the length of that book and how long they will continue to read through that series. Generally speaking, longer series do better because you develop a following. And if you develop a heavy enough following at the beginning, you get enough read through that a longer series actually will produce more income for you, and they do better as far as on the commercial and the sales side. And often it's also easier for a writer to write them because they're in either a familiar setting or with familiar characters. And we'll talk about those things in just a sec here. But the next thing we're going to talk about is the type of series, because the type of series that you write matters as well. So like, are you going to write a trilogy? Are you going to write a super long series? What are you going to do? And a part of what determines that is very simply your genre. There are a lot of cozy mystery series that have been going forever, and they have 30, 40 books, whatever, and people continue to read them all the time. If you think of the Sue Grafton series, the A to Z, all those different things, there's tons of things out there that have extremely long series. And if we said, long series tend to do really well in most genres. Even if you think about high fantasy and epic fantasy, you talk about the Robert Jordan Wheel of Time, the Brandon Sanderson universes, you talk about all those things. And those long books, even with a long series, continue to sell and they continue to work. So within your genre, you can do that. Now, if you tried to have a bunch of 150,000 word romances, you might have a little bit of a harder time selling those. But if you do a bunch of short rom-coms in the 50, 60,000 word range, you'll probably sell those things all day long from now until, they go out of print or you just no longer wish to sell them. And that comes down to the length of each story matters as well, because that depends on also how quickly you can release them. So it depends on your method of publishing and how often you want books to come out and how fast you want them to come out and how you want to manage your writer career. If you want things to come out faster and more often, more frequently, well, then you basically just have to write shorter so that you don't take as much time to write each book. So the length of the story does matter in like how you're going to release things, how you want to manage your author career and how that works for you. The other thing that matters a lot that people often overlook is motivation. Like, well, how much do you like this book? Like, how badly do you want to write this series? That part matters a lot, because if you lose the momentum, you lose the passion for the series. First of all, it comes through in your writing, and your writing isn't as good. Second of all, you just get really discouraged. This is a tough career as it is. Why make it harder on yourself? But we've also all heard about Arthur Conan Doyle and not wanting to write Sherlock Holmes anymore and killing him off and having such an outcry that he actually had to bring him back and being discouraged because people didn't look at what he considered to be his serious work. Okay, so motivation matters, but sometimes your reader motivation may drive you, and your motivation for wanting to make a paycheck may drive you to do different things with your story. Okay. The other thing is your endings matter. So when Arthur Conan Doyle killed off Sherlock Holmes, partly his idea was If I kill him off, then I can end the series. It's rather final. Death tends to be rather final. Of course, that didn't end up being the way it was. He had to find a way to bring him back, and that has happened to authors before. If you've read the book Misery by Stephen King, you understand that, Paul Sheldon had to bring his character back to essentially save his life, right? So endings matter. But so if you end a series definitively, it can be an easy way to basically quit writing that series. It can also enrage your readers, so you have to talk about those different risks. But the ending of each book matters as well, because you want that to hook to the next book, because you want your books have to be connected by something. In order for them to be defined as a series, there has to be a connection between each book. Otherwise, it's not a series, it's just a whole bunch of standalones. So if in the Jack Reacher series, if every time it was about a spy, but the name of the spy changed every time and it wasn't always Jack Reacher, then that wouldn't be the same series. It would be a different series. It'd be a different type of series. Okay. So there are ways to connect your books, right? Through character, through setting, and through storyline, and even through history, various things like that, right? But when you're thinking about a series and you're thinking about how long the series is going to be and how big the series is going to be, one of the first things you need to do is check your setting or settings. Is your world big enough to contain this series? So in other words, if you're going to write an epic fantasy, you need a larger, or an epic sci-fi, you need a larger, broader universe. If you're going to write a cozy mystery, it can happen in a small town, or you can write a Murder, She Wrote in Cabot Cove where people are dying like crazy, so we are not sure how they're replacing the population. So, but you have to define that for yourself. Is your world big enough for this series? So that's the very first thing you ask yourself. Is my world big enough to contain this series? And if it's not, the second question is, can I make it bigger? So if you're dealing with sci-fi and you're dealing with outer space, of course, I can make my settings bigger. I just travel to a different galaxy or travel to a different planet or travel something else. Space is a gigantic setting that if I use it properly, I can use the whole thing and make it work very well. Now, if my setting is a single space station that's constantly orbiting a single moon, things like that, you still have whole worlds to play with, but it could be a little more challenging depending upon the length of your series and what you want your books to be about. So you have to ask yourself, is my world big enough? Can I make it bigger? And the other option you have is you can change your world. So for instance, if you're writing a fantasy of some sort and you add an element of time travel, or same thing with sci-fi, you add an element of time travel, you just changed your setting. Each time you change your setting, you can kind of reset and tell an entirely new story in it. In the case of Capital City Murders, what we essentially did was each city is a different setting, right? Every city is a different setting. So as Nick travels, the setting changes every single time that Nick moves around. So our setting is easily big enough for even 50 novellas and this whole series of books, because the settings change every single week. The setting that Nick travels, the setting changes from Olympia to Salem to Sacramento, and there's a route he follows throughout the whole entire country. So we just changed the settings. You can do the exact same thing with your series. You just, when you're planning, check your settings and determine what you're going to do about your settings. If your setting isn't big enough, then how are you going to make it big enough? How are you going to change it? How are you going to make this work for a series? The more about that you've decided ahead of time, even if it's a rather loose plan. I know I can hear the discovery writers just sighing in the background. Oh, I just don't do that. That's not the way things work for me. Look, you can still do it. You can still do it. Just have a general idea of where you're headed and where you're going. Now, the same thing is true for characters. Now, again, different people start different places with this particular type of thing, with planning a series. So some people start with the characters and the number of characters that they have and who the character is, right? And if you're character driven, this is a fantastic way to start determining what your series is going to look like. Now, either you have to cover a large portion of your character's life in some cases to continue a series, or you have to have kind of a static character like James Bond, John Wick, Jack Reacher, where the character doesn't really change. It's more about the plot and what happens, and in many cases about the bad guy than it is about your main character, right? The other way you could make your series bigger is just increase the number of characters that are there. This is often a thing with epic fantasies, as there are huge numbers of characters. If you think of George R.R. Martin, there are huge numbers of characters, and then he just kills them off when he gets tired of them, which is another option, and then adds some more. So often that is something that can work as well. So you can change your character counts and the number of characters and the type of characters you have as you move through to broaden your series and make it so that you don't stall out. If you have a new character, then you have something new and exciting and fresh for you to write. And it keeps you from becoming bored, essentially, or from becoming stuck and not having anything to write about. Now, we're going to make a transition, and we're going to transition from background ideas of characters, settings, how long your series is going to be, and kind of these general planning ideas to something more specific. So we're going to talk specifically, really quick before we take a break, we're going to talk specifically about big ideas. Okay, we're going to talk about big ideas and the characters involved with those ideas. The character that stays, if you have a character that stays throughout your series. Now, as we said before, the big idea of Capital City Murders was so simple. It's essentially just a photographer traveling around from city to city who discovers a mystery in each one. 50 cities, 50 lengths of 50 books. Simple big idea. Your big idea can be very, very simple. Think about the Star Trek series, the original Star Trek series. What was the big idea? Well, you hear it at the beginning of every single episode. A 5-year mission to boldly go where no man has gone before, yada, 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 yada. And it's reiterated at the beginning of every single episode, right? And there have been spin-off after spin-off and all kinds of things related to that particular series, simply because the big idea was big enough that not only could we operate within that big idea, but then once we went beyond that, we had all these different spin-off series. If you think about all the fanfic that's related to Star Trek and the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of official books that are related to Star Trek, they all relate back to this central idea, basically this big idea. Now, when it comes to your characters, there are a number of things you can do within this big idea. And we're going to explore a few of them really quick. We have to look, what you want to look at in your series is the overall story arc of the series. Now, this can be related to character or it can be related to plot. Now, if you have a plot that's your overall story arc, then you can do different characters and your characters can change and move around and things like that. Or you can have a static hero, kind of like we talked about James Bond, Jack Reacher, those different things. Or you can have a hero who goes through a period of growth. So he goes from being, perhaps the theme of the story is redemption. He goes, like we talked about before, and he goes from being a really bad guy to being a really good guy. And the series outlines that journey of how he comes to that point. Or the series can outline his journey to overcome something from his past or things like that. Or the hero can be a backdrop and a tool, and he can just be what the series is set against. Or you can have the anti-hero story, which in many cases with those, the anti-hero ends up being our hero. If we think about shows like Dexter and Breaking Bad and those various different shows where someone who we should not have idolized, should not have been our hero, and we probably shouldn't have looked up to, ends up being our hero, in the end, because they're an anti-hero, we start rooting for the bad guy. Or in some cases where your hero is the backdrop, the anti-hero story, the bad guy story, is the real meat of the story, and your main character is just the one that solves it and helps resolve the story itself. So but you look at your big idea is basically your overall story arc, whether that's whatever that may be and whatever that may look like for your series. For instance, if we look at the series of Die Hard movies, basically it's just action adventure after action adventure, and the thing that ties them together is John McClane. John McClane is a pretty constant character. He doesn't really change and grow a whole lot. We see some minor growth within him, but for the most part, he's a guy who's isolated on his own and taking on the world because he feels like it's his duty to do so, right? And plenty of series have been written with a constant character, and it can work extremely well. And look at the number of series and the number of movies that have come out of that particular thing. There's also, this is a series by a friend of mine, Kate Robbins, and her series is tied together by the setting, which is the Scottish Highlands. So and the characters that tie it together are really this royal family and the Highland chiefs themselves, right? But it's not the same Highland chief throughout. But the setting and the period in history is what really ties this together and stays the same, which makes these books into a series. So we've got a couple examples that we've looked at. We've looked at, a big series where the character is the constant, but the character doesn't really change, or the characters change, but the setting does not change. The big thing to remember is that you have to have some kind of a connection. That's what makes your series a series. What makes the reader want to go from reading one to reading the next one and the next one and the next one? Is that connection enough to compel them to move through this series? That's the most important thing about your big idea, is the connection. And we're going to look in more detail at the connection in our next section of things, when we start to really get down to some of the brass tacks of planning. Okay, before we move on from big ideas to small ideas, I want to show you what this kind of looks like in the Plottr software that I use. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the way I do this. So I've got the big idea, right? And I'm going to show you, this is a section of basically books 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 for the Capital City Murders series. So I have those mapped out inside of one particular plotter, okay, in one particular Plottr file. So I have, under the project tab, you can see the names of the books, that I have these all lined out. I have the names of the books here. I can add covers here, as I have covers made. But the main thing I want you to see in this is the timeline view. So I've looked through every one of these different cities, and I've decided what's going to happen there. So what's going to happen to Nick that fits in the overall platform of the story? So what happens to him in Axton, Austin, that relates to the overall themes? And there's an underlying romance that he's developed with this gal named Sandra. So we're following through what's happening with her. And then we're also following through Nick's parents, which is part of what's in his home life, which also gives a different theme and an underlying story, constant story, to these various different books, right? And so I use this for the overall outline of the books themselves. Then in Plottr, I switch to the individual book. And in the individual book, I've got a lot of different things that talk about the novel in specific. Like, how does this novel happen? What is the crime? How does Nick discover it? How does Nick become involved? And what does that look like? And then ultimately, how does he solve the crime? So we've gone from the big idea of the project, which has all of the books in it and a timeline related to that particular project, that shows what's going to happen in the underlying, basically the main plot and the various B plots throughout the series in each individual book. So then as I approach the outline for each individual book, I have a template and a theme and an outline to work from. You'll also notice that in this file, I have characters that I've pulled in, different characters with different pictures. And I haven't pulled in all the minor characters necessarily, but I've pulled in the characters so I can look back and reference them and make sure I'm consistent from book to book. Also, in this particular case, I pulled in settings, and I pulled in this one particular setting that relates to this book, but I can pull in whatever settings I would like related to all the books, so I can get the overall big picture of the entire series by going and looking at the project timeline and determining where I'm going to go from there. So what's going to happen in each book? What's going to happen within the series? And what is going to affect Nick that continues to affect him for the rest of the series? Then from that project part, I can look down at the individual books, and I can see the individual timelines and see what's happening in those in each particular book. So I've gone from the big idea to the smaller idea of the book. And then within the book, using Plottr, I can go down to the even smaller idea of what's going to happen in each scene. And you'll see that I have added things to these scenes like goal, motive, conflict, and the various different emotions that I'm looking for, so that as I'm writing, I'm always staying within the boundaries that I have set for the series. So this is how I do the planning stage of things, and then I transfer this to Scrivener and do the writing from there. But before we moved on from big ideas down into these small ideas, I wanted to show you what this looks like in this particular planning software. Now, as I said, you can use any planning software. You don't have to use Plottr. I've seen people do similar things in various sheets on Excel spreadsheets. God bless those people. I really struggle with those type of Excel spreadsheets, but I've seen people do it in Word. I've seen people do this a variety of different ways. But what you're doing is going from your high-level series idea, and you're going down and diving in to your more specific ideas as you go, making sure that those align with the big idea. That alignment is what keeps you on track and keeps you from stalling. So in just a few minutes, we're going to go ahead and take a break. But before we do that, I want to review that we talked about basically going from your big ideas to your small ideas. And we talked about the different foundations for that big idea. The big idea that you have related to the setting, checking your settings, checking your characters, and making sure this is the kind of idea that you can make into a series that is much larger and a much broader scope than just a book. We also talked about making sure that if your world is not big enough, that you can make it bigger, or that you can change the setting, and that you have a plan for these things. The biggest thing behind all of these, and the things we'll cover in the next session, is basically so that you don't get stuck, so that you don't stall, so you don't encounter writer's block that's as a result of planning this series. The biggest thing is to keep writing every single day and keep making progress every single day, regardless of what that looks like for you, whether that's a page or a chapter or whatever you're able to accomplish with the time that you have available. Now, in our next session, we're going to talk about those smaller ideas, the book ideas, the chapter ideas, and how to plan those out, even if you're not necessarily a big plotter, so that you don't get stuck. We're basically talking about writer's block prevention, but on a larger, grander scale, because we're talking series, not books. But each series is made up of a number of books, and each book is made up of a number of chapters, and each chapter is made up of a number of scenes, and any one of those things can block you. And we don't want that to happen. So what I want you to do on your break is to think about those things. think about the things that block you. Think about the things that have prevented you from planning and writing a series and getting that series out into the world in the way that you would like to do that. I want you to think about those things. And then when we come back, we'll dive in really deep with some hands-on type things, some things you can take home with you. I'm also going to give you a resources page. I don't want to give it to you now because I don't want you to use your break to be looking over all of those things, but I'm going to give it to you at the end of the next session. That's going to give you an opportunity to go in, find out the different tools that you need, find the different tools and the different applications that you need, different books that you can read that may help you, that may improve your writing and improve your planning of a series. By adding those things to your toolbox, my hope is that you are able to plan the perfect series to prevent stalls. All right. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed your break. I hope that it went well and that you got something to drink, something to eat, maybe chatted with a few people. Since we did introductions last time, we're just going to jump right into this section of the presentation because we're really going to get down to brass tacks. So we talked in the first session about the series development process. The first method of doing that, basically my method of doing that, as you go from the series idea to the individual book idea to the chapter and scene ideas. So we go from big ideas to small ideas, and that's the progression that we're going to make. So to review, when we talked about a series, we talked about what characters do you have in your series? What is the series about? Your setting. Where does the series take place? How does everything work together? Those type of things. When does the series happen? That affects your setting and how things happen and how big your series can be. If your series happens over an extended period of time, it can be even larger. Those are all things that are related to what we called the big idea. The big idea is basically just the idea of the series. And we looked at how we look at those different things in Plottr and in other software. Now what we're going to talk about is we're going to get down to the level of the book idea. So we've come from the giant level of the series, we've come down, and we're going to look at each individual book in the series. Now, there's a number of ways to do this. Some people plan out their whole series at one time. So they sit down and they figure out what's going to happen in detail in each book and plot all of that out. Some of you are more of discovery writers and you get into that and you go, oh my goodness, I'm not going to do this. You just start writing the book and you see kind of where things go and you kind of have a general direction that you're heading. That works fine with a series as long as you kind of stay on the same general direction and don't have to rework the series several times as you go along. That's one of the results. That's one of the things that results in stalling. But on the other hand, as I said last hour, most writers are not pure plotters or pure discovery writers. So most discovery writers actually plot at some point or another. Just sometimes their plots are not as robust and not as large and not as full as someone who's a true plotter who outlines every single detail. There are some authors that write the last sentence of their book before they write the first one. I am not nearly on that level. I am also more of a blended writer in that I have a pretty robust outline, I have a pretty robust plot, but also as the book goes along and the characters do their things, sometimes you discover that the way the book comes out is a little bit different than what you had planned. If it's a little bit different, that works well into a series. But if it's a lot different, sometimes that can create problems for you down the road. The main thing is to not let it get you stuck. But even if you're a discovery writer, Here are the key things that you need to make an individual book within the series work. Okay, number one, you need the connection. Remember, we talked about how each book has to have something that connects it to the others. That's what makes it a series, whether that's the setting, the historical time period, the characters, different things like that, whatever that is, that connection is what makes this a series. So for a book to fit into the series, the very first thing you want to look at with your book idea is how is this connected? Now, if you're writing a book with a series of characters, like we talked about the series Die Hard, if John McClane is the main character, it's part of the Die Hard series. It's really not that difficult. In the Star Trek books that we talked about, if it's set in the Star Trek universe, it's a Star Trek book and can be considered part of the Star Trek, at least a part of the Star Trek fandom and the Star Trek overall series, even if it's not a part of the original series. Okay, so the first thing is the connection. How is this book connected to the rest of the series? The second is the satisfying plot. One of the most difficult parts about a middle book of a trilogy is giving it a satisfying plot, because really what you're doing is taking the reader from book A, where the action begins to rise and we begin to see the central conflict of the series, to book 3, where we know that that resolves and the series ends in some way that is satisfying. But each book must have its own satisfying plot. Now, with book 1, that's generally a little bit easier. You end it as the rising action has come to a climax and the sleuth or the main character or whatever has some kind of a resolution and is ready to move on to book number 2. So there's a hook that drags you into book number 2, but book number 1 resolves very nicely. Book number 3 is easy to do that. You build on the rising action that came at the climax, perhaps, that's coming out of book 2, and it's rising to in book 3 that has a series of try-fails, and ultimately your main character triumphs or your main character fails, depending upon the type of book that you're writing. But that middle book can be a little bit tough to get a satisfying plot, because there needs to be a story as well as that journey that gets us from point A to point B. So one of the things with each book is you need to at least plan out something of a satisfying plot. What happens in this book? Not what happens that relates to the overall series, but that makes this book satisfying on its own. Ideally, your series book should be that if someone picks up book 2, they should be able to read it, understand the story, and go back to book 1 to get the beginning part of the story and still be satisfied with book 2. They should still be satisfactory as standalones. And that's a really tough thing to do. And as much as I endeavor to do that with the Capital City Murders series and some of my other books, really, it's truly, you almost need to go back to the first book and start there to get, or at least part of the books, to start there and get the background behind the story. Now, Capital City Murders was a little easier to make each one because he moves locations to make each one stand alone. But some other books, that is actually really tough. So the next thing is the hook or the resolution. At the end of the book, what hooks the reader to go into the next books, or in the case of the final book in the series, how is everything resolved? Are there loose ends left behind that the reader's really going to wonder about? Now, it's fine if you want to leave 1 or 2 of those that are kind of vague, that might lead the reader into another book should you decide to continue the series. However, you don't want there to be big things unresolved at the end of a series, kind of like at the end of a book. You need to resolve the book, make it a complete story, even though there's a hook to the next book. And at the end of the series, you want to resolve the entire series. Even though there may be a hook that allows you to continue the series or do spin-offs, you want it to be a satisfying resolution for the reader. The other thing about your book idea is you want to avoid the sagging middle. Now, we talked about that being as a part of the series, that you wanted to avoid that sagging middle in the second book where it's just a part of the journey. It's the exact same thing in the book idea. Now, one of the things that I do to do this is I use outline templates to help me. Now, those outline templates help me to get my pacing right and to make sure that I haven't left gaps there in the middle that make it so that part of the book sags. Now, when we're looking at these individual books and how they fit in the series, we need to look at some basic questions. So we look at who. Remember when we talked about the big idea, we talked about one of the things is your characters. So we look at who in this book makes it so this book fits in with the rest of the series. Are these relatives of the main character, or are they somehow in the same occupation as the main character? For instance, we use the Highland Chief series as an example. The example in that particular book would be that the clan of Highland chieftains of Highland chiefs is the connection between the books in the series. So is the when, which is the time frame that the books are set in. If you have historical novels and you move from event to event within a specific time frame, that when is what often ties the books together. And the other thing that can allow the book to fit into the series is the where, the setting. Remember, we talked about that, about the setting of the Highlands in Scotland and the Highland Chiefs. And so we've talked about different books where the setting, like the Star Trek universe as well, where the setting is what carries things from book to book and ensures that they're in the same series. Now, the next thing you're going to ask about the book is where it fits in the series arc, if there is one. So if there's a series arc story and you're not just writing Jack Reacher or James Bond type style things where it's just an action story after an action story after an action story, where does it fit in the series arc? Is this the introduction and the rising action? Is this book 2 where there should be some tri-fails and some more rising action? And this is what helps you avoid the sagging middle in those trilogies. Or is it book 3 where there's a resolution? Now, obviously, if your series is longer than this, you need to spread these different parts of the series arc actually out over your series. And what I often do is if I'm writing a longer series like that, I'll use a template, like an outlet or a Plottr template, like, for example, I'll use the hero's journey, for instance, to cover several different books. So overall, my hero has a journey throughout those several books in the series that he follows, and that gives him a rising and falling action, and it helps me to pace the series properly so you avoid those books that are just sagging books, because when you have a longer series, sometimes that sagging middle can be 3 books long, and it's something that you really don't want. So where is the book in the series arc? So when you're looking at the individual books, that's what you look at. So here's a real life example. This happens to be one of mine. This is a really old series, well, really old in my writing lifetime. It was published a dozen years ago when I was first starting out and really didn't know what I was doing in the self-publishing world, but it still turned out to be a great series. So there are 3 books in the series, and Redemption starts out with Sam becoming a lawyer while he's in prison, which isn't terribly plausible, but we made it work anyway. And so he gets out of prison. We see the central conflict of Sam versus his past and his own faults. And we see how he uses his strengths and his faults to help other people around him, which is really what Sam's goal is to help other people. Now, in Temptation, Sam has become very prideful because he's very good at what he does. And so he encounters a lying client who is deceptive to him, and his lies are good. So Sam has to figure out what those lies are and how to deal with that. Like, as a lawyer, does he try to win, or does he pass on winning in favor of embracing the truth? And then Confession kind of wraps things all up because there's kind of a religious undertone to all of the books and something about Sam's mother and what the things that she believes about him. And we resolve all those things in Confession, and it forces Sam into a position where at the end of it, he has to make a major decision about his life. Now, the book was left enough open that if I really wanted to, I could have pursued it and added another to the series or added a prequel to the series or something along that line. But really, I resolved things in such a way with Confession that I have not gone back to that series yet because I really haven't wanted to. And because I fit it there, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's why I resolved it all within a trilogy. So the trilogy was planned. Now, this happened long before I had something like Plottr. Okay. But Plottr allows you to build this series inside in a series Bible, kind of like I showed you the last time. And we're going to look at one of those really quickly again at the one that I had for Capital City Murders. And we basically looked at those different things. I look at the different books and what's going to happen in each in a progression that relates to the overall series and the overall character arc of basically in that series from Nick going as being a photographer, and that's his focus, to focusing more and more on these mysteries and things that he's solving, to the point that when he's done with the series, he's basically going to be in the same position where he's going to be faced with a choice. What do I do about my life? Do I become an amateur sleuth and go use my detecting powers to go solve crimes? Or do I continue to pursue this career as a photographer? And now that I'm not on the road all the time, I can get away from all these mysteries that I keep encountering. So it's kind of the same thing. We built a series Bible, which has all kinds of books, all of the books in it and all the outlines of the various different books and an overall timeline for the entire series. That's basically, we've decided where each book fits within the series. And the biggest issue with this trilogy, especially as I was a relatively young writer as far as in the publishing realm, was avoiding the sagging middle with temptation, was not allowing temptation to become a problem for me and to become the sagging middle. The chapter ideas. We're going to talk about chapter ideas because, of course, now once we have the book, holistically, we say, okay, now we know where this book fits in to this series overall. We know how the plot fits. We know what the connection is. We know what the setting is. We know what all those things. And then we come down to plotting the chapters and the parts within that book. Now, this is where I find Plottr and tools like it incredibly helpful. And I'll have a resources page on my website that I was telling you about when I started this thing. But the biggest thing that Plottr allows me to do is, first of all, it allows me to use templates of various different accepted plot types to make sure that my pacing is correct, that I'm on pace and I'm not hitting that sagging middle, but that I'm also aiming in the right direction, that I'm not going to mess up my series by having a plot that's completely different and completely out there from the rest of the series. Now, there's a ton of books I'd recommend to you on plotting. If you're a discovery writer, the book Take Off Your Pants, as funny as the name is a fantastic resource for basically learning to create a somewhat unstructured story that's still plotted enough that you can make it fit into your series and make it fit into other different things that you're doing. But there are much more structured books. Story Engineering, The Snowflake Method. The Snowflake Method has a software that goes with it. If you buy the book, you get the software for free, and that software will even integrate with Plottr and other types of plotting software. There's $1 Million Outlines by Dave Farland. There's Story Engineering. There's Save the Cat, and the new Save the Cat wrote a novel. And all these different things that you can use to plan out the plotting of your books and the plotting of your stories within those books. Discovering writing often leads, as I've said a couple times, often leads to replanning the series. So be careful. Now, planning one at a time and kind of leaving the overall series arc more vague, or writing a series where you kind of have a static set of characters and it's really the plot and the things like that that drive the series, can be a solution that allows you to be a little bit looser and to not plot quite as strictly as you might have to if you really want a series to follow a very firm trajectory. So that's how that works. Now, I recommend that you plot, that you go through and plot those individual chapters. You don't have to go down as far as individual scenes, but you can. That's the style that I like to do. But it is everybody has their own writing style, and I've met so many people who use different tools in so many different ways that I will never tell you that you can't do something a different way. In fact, I will always tell you that if something feels super awkward to you, as far as writing is concerned, and it makes writing harder for you, don't do that. Do the things that make writing easier for you and make it something that you enjoy. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about hits home to me extremely. Like I talked about in the first session, in my confession time, essentially I had a series. It did not go the way I wanted it to. It did not go as well as I would have liked it to. And essentially part of that was we were rushing things. So in this particular case, I want to talk about timeline, like how long it actually takes to write a series, because the answer to this question depends entirely on you. Now, we tried, because I was writing full time. The guy I was working with was retired, so he didn't have other commitments, so he could make writing really his primary, writing and marketing this book, his primary thing. Now, that didn't end up working out for a variety of reasons, but here's the thing. We were trying to write the series way too fast. First of all, there's an emotional drain every time you finish a book, regardless of how long that book is, and a time when you need a breather and you need to just relax for a while and let your muse kind of glory in the fact that you finished something and you wrote the end. So that is really, really important. So if you don't give yourself that time, now for a full-time writer, sometimes that can be a day or 12 hours or a couple of days. That's fine if that's what you can do. But many people work full-time jobs too. Really, if you're writing intensely on the weekends and writing a little bit throughout the week, maybe you need a week or two off. So you need to really give yourself that space. Second of all, you need time to revise and rewrite the book and then send it through editors and beta readers and all that kind of things to get it polished, regardless of whether you're going to publish it yourself and do the self-publishing route, or if you're going to send it to an agent or an editor. An agent or an editor, the cleaner your book is when they get it, the better it is for them. So make life easy on them and make your book as clean as possible before you hand it over. It's really, really important, right? So you need to allow yourself time for that before you start into the next book. Or even if you're one of those people that can start into the next book while you're editing the other one, your pace is definitely going to be slower. So give yourself time, pace yourself, give yourself the opportunity to write at a sustainable pace that your muse can handle. The reason is quite simple. If you don't, you will burn out. If you don't, you will eventually stall, because you'll sit down and ask your muse to show up when it's time for you to write, and she will quite simply tell you no. So we want to avoid writer's block and that kind of things at all costs. So that means you have to pace yourself and write at a pace that's comfortable for you. I often tell people, if you write a single page every day, at the end of a year, you'll have a 365-page book. That's pretty good. If that's the pace that you can work with, then in releasing your series, a book every year, year and a half is absolutely fine. Now, if you're going to do this for a living, there are some other aspects to that you need to understand before you have to maintain a certain pace. But there are ways to give yourself breathers, give yourself time off, and enable yourself to keep going in the way that you want to keep going. Take breaks when you have to. Not too long, but take breaks. Write stuff other than what is in your series. whether that is short stories, whether it's spin-offs of your series, whether it's blog posts. If you're like me, I do a lot of freelance writing so I have a lot of interesting topics I write on a lot of the time, and that gives me a nice diversion from fiction that clears my mind and lets me come back to it fresh. So write other things that allow you to come back to that fresh, especially when you're in that revision process. Give it some time to rest before you look at it again. You'll see more of your errors. You can fix them easier before you have to hand it off to an editor, and so you can work that way. Stop whenever you're ready. So if you are done with a series and you absolutely are at the point where you just despise it, stop whenever you're ready. Now, a part of this is we want to honor our fans as well. If our fans have followed us through this journey and we've said, we've got this 7-book series coming, and you ended at the 6th book, that's actually absolutely fine. If that's when you need to stop because you're ready, end it there. But in doing so, honor your fans. Give them a resolution and deliver resolution every time with every single book. But don't burn yourself out. As my saying goes, don't set yourself on fire to keep somebody else warm. Okay, how do you keep writing every day? Well, here's some of my tips. First of all, plan ahead. What I mean by plan ahead is you set writing appointments with yourself and you keep them. I talk about this a lot in my writing book that talks about writing as a business. And that's one of the key principles in that book. Set yourself appointments for writing and keep them. Tell your family, your dog, your friends, whoever you need to tell that, hey, this is when I'm writing. Plan meals ahead, whatever you need to do, but don't miss your writing appointments. Write every day. If that's a half an hour a day, if it's an hour a day, whatever that looks like, keep those writing appointments. Second of all, when you stop writing in the middle of the day, leave yourself on a cliffhanger. Don't allow yourself to stop writing. Give yourself that cliffhanger you would give the reader that makes you, when you start writing again, you're excited about writing because you want to see what happens next. Okay, don't revise as you go. Please don't revise as you go. You will create faster and cleaner first drafts by finishing your draft first and then going back to revise. If you go back and revise as you're drafting, it tends to create editing problems for you later on. So stop revising, finish drafting. Next point is listen to your characters. Now, sometimes your characters are going to tell you, we want to go this way, we don't want to go this way. That plot you had laid out, that's really funny, that's great, but that's not going to work for us, because you get to know them as you move along. And hopefully, if you have the same characters throughout your series, you've got to know them well enough. You kind of know when they might go off the rails, and you can either bring them back because you really want them to adhere to this plot, or you can listen to what they're saying and follow them and see where it goes. Okay, but listen to your characters. Sometimes your characters will have the best ideas, and that will make your series that much better. Now, the last thing on this particular slide is listen to realize the folly of perfection. Okay, your book and your story is never going to be perfect. And here's the thing you have to realize: writers see things that readers never see. So we just sweat over those little details, and there are things readers will never see in your books. So I'll give you an example. In the Capital City Murders books, I found what I consider to be, it's a pretty obvious error in the Hanging in Helena book. Now, it's not huge, it's not plot stopping, but it's an error that I don't like seeing in that book. And where I caught it was when I was listening to the audiobook recording of the book, and I listened to it and I said, oh my goodness, that is not good. I really wish that wasn't in there. But of course, by that point, it's written, the audiobook is recorded. There's really not much I can do about going back and changing it without literally spending thousands of dollars to get rid of that one error. I have gotten one email from a reader about an error in Hanging in Helena, and it was not that one. In that particular book, I have Nick going into a bar and he orders a huckleberry beer of some sort. And basically, the guy emailed me and told me that that particular brewery does not have that type of huckleberry beer, but they have a huckleberry stout that's really good. So the thing that he noticed was not even the plot error that I noticed, was not even the things that I noticed about the book. It was that there was a different beer at that brewery than the one that I had put in the book. So believe me, first of all, you're never going to get it perfect. Second of all, even if you do, a reader is going to find something that is not even related, or they're just going to read and absorb your books and enjoy them without even realizing or acknowledging that that error is there. We want to strive for getting your books as great as you can before you release them, but realize when you start, especially when you're embarking on a series, that there is no hope for being absolutely perfect. There just isn't. The last thing I'm going to say, though, is that I do want you, when you're planning your series, to be ambitious. So the best goals, the ones that make us stretch, especially in the writing realm, are ones that push our limits a little bit. You can figure out your writing pace, you can figure out, and there's all kinds of planning tools that enable you to do that. So you can figure out kind of what you can do and what you can't do when it comes to writing, and how fast you can do it, and how quickly you can produce a series. And then you can stretch those goals a little bit and be ambitious. And a lot of this depends on you and your lifestyle and how you live and how you write and what your goals are. But the biggest key is that while you want to be ambitious, you don't want to be ridiculous. So our initial plan for Capital City Murders was we were doing what was called 50 and 50. We were going to release 50 novellas in 50 months. Now, some of you may have gone, and some people, when I told them that, they said, "You guys are crazy." The thing was, I poo-pooed them at the time and said, "No, we're not crazy. This is something we can do." But they were absolutely right. Our goals were ridiculous. There was no way that we could produce high quality, the right kind of books in that limited amount of time unless that was the only thing that we were doing. And it simply wasn't. Okay. So I want you to be ambitious. I want you to have goals that stretch you, that make you work to accomplish them. But don't be ridiculous with your plans with your series. Now, a friend of mine has a thing that she calls a 12-month rolling writing calendar. And what I like about it is there's a lot of built-in flexibility. So we have goals for the years, but as you finish one project, you move on to the next, realizing that whether or not you're on time or behind for that project matters less than the fact that you know what goals are next for you and you know what you're doing next. Yes, we want to achieve our goals, but if you have a root canal and you're out for 2 weeks, or in 2020, if you had COVID and you're out for a couple of weeks, there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. And it shouldn't create stress in your life because you have to come back to writing a little later than you had planned. You have to give yourself latitude and freedom to be a human being, not a writing robot. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I tend to be so driven that then when I don't achieve what I'm going for, I get really upset with myself and down on myself. And that is not a good thing. And it's not a position that you want to put yourself in. So when it comes to your writing goals, be reasonable and forgive yourself if you don't make them. Okay, the final thing I'm going to tell you about perfect series plotting is there is no perfect series plotting. there is a perfect series plotting for you. What I've outlined in these last couple hours is ideas that I have of like that are broad ideas in a lot of ways. They're like, these are the ways that you can do this. This is a good way to plan. Go from big to small, develop your ideas that way, right? But they are not absolutely necessary. None of these steps is something that if you skipped it or did it in a different order, that suddenly your series wouldn't work and you're not a real writer for some reason. Ignore all the self-talk that tells you things like that. The perfect series plotting is what works for you. Now, I'm going to recommend that you at least loosely outline your series and your novels. I'm going to recommend that at least you have an idea of what's going to happen in the various chapters, if it's at all possible, or that if you're a discovery writer, you have an outline that's loose enough that gives you the freedom to discover things as you go and allows you to change your series and flow your series with whatever your characters happen to do. Whether you start with your big series idea as a setting and a place, or as a series of events, or whether you start that with a group of characters and you set them on an adventure to see what happens, it doesn't matter. There is no right or wrong. And anyone tells you they have the perfect formula for writing a series or a novel, they're wrong. They're absolutely wrong. In fact, writers often give writers the worst advice. Here's the thing: listen to your gut, listen to who you are. Plan your series in a way that works for you using the tools that work for you. Plottr and Scrivener may not work for you at all. You may be an Excel spreadsheet and Google Docs person. It doesn't matter. You can do this any way that works for you. The methods are really very general and they're set that way on purpose. You have a lot of freedom within any kind of a system like this to do it your own way and follow your own personality. Now, last thing before I take questions, I'm going to put up a resources page in the comments. I'll put it up on the screen here as well. I also have a free book that's called 7 Steps to Plotting Your Novel Quickly. Again, this is one of those things that if you do things in a different order, it's really not going to break my heart. In fact, nobody will ever know. You can do them in whatever order that you want, but it gives you an outline for how to properly plot each novel within the series. And to do it quickly so that you can get on with the writing process. That resource page will have links to Plottr, it'll have links to Scrivener, it'll have links to a number of articles that talk about the various different ways to plot your novel and some different templates. There's some different templates and formats and things that you can do. So explore those resources, use what works for you, whatever doesn't work for you, happily throw it out. I'm also always welcome to feedback if you think I missed a resource or if you think that there's a resource that shouldn't be there, do please let me know. I'm absolutely open to those things. I'm excited to hear from all of you, and I'm also excited to see what series you produce through the things that you've learned here. I'm going to open it up to questions. I'll be around live and I'll be in the chat. And even if you don't encounter me now, find me somewhere at the conference. I'll be around on several different panels. I'll be in rooms in between those. And tomorrow I do have a panel on book advertising, on paid advertising. And I talk about whether it's a budget buster or a book booster and how you can make it work for you. So thanks for tuning in again. Thanks for joining me for the second hour. I hope that you got a lot out of this presentation. And now it's open for questions. And if I don't see you in the questions, I'll see you soon. Thanks for coming. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I hope you're enjoying my recorded presentation. And let me know if you guys have any questions on this first part. We, of course, have part 2 coming up next hour where we'll talk more about ideas in depth.
All right, so I've got some questions for you here from the chat. So first, we're going to go to one from Green Dragon. So, what are some techniques that can ramp up the stakes from one book to the next, like in a trilogy? You don't want to downplay the first book's climax, but you want the stakes to keep getting bigger for a huge final payoff.
Right. So I usually have an overall story arc of some sort. That is, it runs almost like a B story through each book, but at the end of each book, there needs to be two things. First of all, a climax because we want to resolve that book completely, but also there needs to be a hook to the next book that does raise the stakes. So, for instance, in my I'll just use this example because I have this book in front of me because I'm giving one away this weekend. This book Harvested, the sequel is coming out, and basically, my lead detective, who's the same detective through the entire series, the next crime he has to solve is much more challenging and much more difficult than his kind of initial one. So I think there's a certain element of just escalate the B story part of it as well. He's searching for his missing wife. You know, he finds out at the end of this book that he finds out some critical things about what has happened to her. And in the next book, he finds out more of those critical things. And those are hinted at the end of Harvested before you get into Teaching Moments, which is the sequel. So I think it's that underlying B story. You need to have a hook at the end of your book that leads into the next one, but then you need to pay off on that hook. The reader is going to be expecting that to be there. So you need to basically keep your promises to them in that next book.
All right, excellent. So, next here we have from Kiri. Are you allowed to leave things open and not write a series?
Sure, you can, depending upon the number of readers you have and how bad it ticks them off. Um, you can. I mean, there have been people that have done it. They've written books or whatever, and they've said, you know, I want to make this into a series, or I don't want to make it into a series. I didn't plan to make it into a series, and then they just don't. And the reader says, well, there's these unanswered questions, and the author says, well, I was done writing, so sorry about that. So you can. It's just a matter of if you have a certain number of reader base. Look at, I know we talked about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and him liking his serious work much better than Sherlock Holmes and killing him off. Well, the fans wouldn't stand for that. So he had to find a way to bring him back. So it really depends on your fan base and really what you're doing it for. If you're writing for a living and people really clamor for a sequel, you may have to figure out a way to bring that um, character back.
All right, excellent. So, next and the last for this section, although the next recording is a little bit shorter, so we'll be able to go for some more long questions on the next one. C. Ray to Arc asks, could you give an example of a hero used as a backdrop or tool?
Sure. James Bond, John Wick. Um, Really, in most ways, John McClane from Die Hard he's really the back part of the story. He's kind of the hero that kind of brings things together. But if you look at his story arc, it's pretty much the same in all of the Die Hard movies. He doesn't change and grow a whole lot as a person. His family grows up around him, but the stories themselves is what's, when we look at Die Hard with a Vengeance and all the different Die Hard series, basically it's a really interesting story that John McClane's the one that gets to solve it. But Jack Reacher is much the same. Jack Reacher doesn't grow a whole lot in those books. It's the stories that are around him that make the difference. So that's what I would say is those are some examples, really quick examples of where the hero is just used as a backdrop of the story, and it's really the plot that drives those stories. And we come back to see John McClane because we know he always survives, but there's not a lot of character growth there.